because I remember when Lance Bailey was running around in the hallways at SSH talking about SimGHOSTS and getting people organized and having more simulation tech content at SSH, which at that point was not really listening too well. I think SSH is listening very well now. So there's a little subtext there. I'm just going to say that. I just came from Las Vegas, where I graduated from high school in 1972, and our senior trip was to Los Angeles, to Huntington Beach on the cheese bus that I came here today in. So it's kind of fun there's full circle coming back all these years. And back then, this again, 1972, when you descended, Ed Rivera, how do you do? We descended from Las Vegas into Los Angeles, you were descending into yellow soup. I don't know if any of you have lived here long enough to experience that. It is so much clearer today. However, I still react to stuff like this, and so I have water up here. You'll see me taking sips every now and then because LA is draining down my throat. I just don't do well in this kind of particulate environment, so I just want to say that. In case you see me suddenly disappear behind the stage, that's what's going on here. So I'd like this to be interactive. If you have questions along the way or you have things you want to say, I want you to please jump up. Would you please give me the 10-minute mark? Yes. So be sure and do that. I've never been to SimGHOSTS, and I want to kind of get a feel for the audience. How many of you in here are in healthcare, as in nurse, physician, paramedic? Raise hands. Okay. How many of you are IT who have migrated into simulation? So about half and half. Okay. So we all are facing the same thing. We are crazy people, and you are not as crazy as we were 10 years ago when the rooms were not really full of people, and we really didn't know that much about what we were doing. A lot of things have happened. A lot of things have happened over this summer. So I'm going to be talking about a lot of things that really affect you, and you really, in many cases, are the linchpin in any simulation center. You are going to know more, literally, although a lot of us don't want to know it, about everybody, who's a good teacher, who's not, who's a good debriefer, who's not, who actually knows what they're doing, who doesn't, what administrators are actually really with it and are going to make a great university, those that are not. You're going to know everything. And so I'm going to tell you some of those other things that you want to know, that you can perhaps be the voice of reason for people when they want to go off in left and right fields there as we move forward in time. There's a lot more known now than 10 years ago, than 5 years ago, than 3 years ago. And so I hope to leave you with a few things that you're going to go back and say, did you know? And they're not going to know. And so that I'm giving you value added here at SimGHOSTS. So I bring you greetings from the board of the ENAXL organization. How many of you know there's an ENAXL organization? How many of you know what ENAXL stands for? That's right. Because I said, as I became editor of their journal, and they would be so angry at me for 2 years for not being able to remember the name of the organization, I said, what nut names an organization something like this? I said, it doesn't come trippingly off the tongue. It's not easily memorable. And then people can't even pronounce ENAXL. They say ENAXL, and I just kind of, ugh. But it's the way that it is. So ENAXL stands for the International Nursing Association of Clinical Simulation and Learning. So there are two ways that simulation became formed. In the medical world, they always had simulation labs with mannequins. They did not have IV start arms and things like this. A lot of times the nursing educators at the hospitals provided those things for medical students. In the nursing world, nursing students always had fabulous labs with static mannequins. And simulation, when it started up, we migrated those very fancy high fidelity mannequins into the skills lab. The thinking that runs a skills lab is not the same thinking that it takes for simulation. Skills lab people are very step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. They love checklists. Simulationists don't work well with checklists. We are the wild and woolly West. We don't know what we're doing. We don't know what the student's going to do next or the learner's going to do next. And so medicine has not had to fight the battles that nursing necessarily has had to fight in academia, because we came from very different mindsets. And so today we're kind of almost merging. And the initial boards of an AXL started out as a skills lab conference. Simulation happened to come along. It's crazy. And so the AXL organization had to develop a new mindset and get new leaders in that could be able to think more broadly and not as much as a checklist goes. So there has been a lot of a change within that organization also as we move forward in time. So again, I bring you greetings from the AXL organization, and our president and some of your people are probably going to be at the Global Simulation Network meeting in Europe pretty quick, if it's not happening right now. So AXL's vision and mission to be nursing's portal to the world of clinical simulation. I only say this because nursing is the largest end user of simulation and probably always will be around the world, just because there's more of us than any other health profession. So we have a great goal. We're working on it. I think we're getting better and better at what we do, and I think SimGHOSTS is going to be providing a lot of help that we need as we move forward in time. We do have a journal. I'm the editor of that journal. For those in the academic world, having an impact factor is really important. We're getting an impact factor. It'll be announced in July of 2016. Anything that's been published for the last 3 years up to 2016, so that's really about 2014, 15, 13, will have an impact factor associated with it, and those are the articles that are being evaluated for impact factor. We are listed in Science Direct and CINAHL. We are seeking listing in Medline. I don't know how many of you read Simulation in Healthcare. For many of us, it has some things that are useful, but I think for what you do, clinical simulation in nursing has more of what might be of interest to you oftentimes in your work. I also want to encourage you to write for us and to submit. Many of you are the ones that are inventing things that we need to know. And so when you come up with a nice tweak to something, or how do you make this run, how do you make that run, I don't have a lot of that kind of stuff coming into clinical simulation in nursing. I would love to have that available to our lone dancer nursing faculty who don't know about SimGHOSTS yet and don't know that you exist, and that we need that kind of expertise, because a lot of us are very good clinically, but we do not know the tech side, and we're having to make it up as we go along. And sometimes we come up with pretty good stuff, but if somebody's already done it, why aren't we out there sharing information? So I would love to have you write for us. We take things from all disciplines. You don't have to be a nurse to publish with us. Please see me later if you're interested in that. I'm happy to talk with you. We have another thing that you might be interested in, a conference or a contest every year and a site on the NLN website called Homegrown Simulation Solutions. You can put up videos, you can put up little written bits there. If you don't have enough for a little column or an article, this might be a place for you to put up, this is how we did something or how we solved a problem. So there are many venues for your expertise. You are the experts in this area. You ought to give yourselves credit for that, and you can help grow SimGHOSTS as an organization by doing things like this, because you can say, as a member of SimGHOSTS, I am submitting this. Our conference next year is at the Gaylord Texan Resort in Grapevine, Texas, June 15th through 18th. You might consider going there, or you might have faculty that you want to send there. Please take note of that and consider that for your future educational needs. The most important thing that's happened for most of us in the nursing world finished up in 2013. It was the National Council of State Boards of Nursing National Simulation Study. I was one of the 2 nursing consultants on that study. The other one is very active in simulation, Dr. Pam Jeffries. And this study is landmark, and it's changed the face of education as we know it. And what we did was take the incoming cohort of 10 schools of nursing across the United States and randomize them at each school into either 50% of all their clinical time was in simulation, or 25%, or 10% of all their time in simulation. So that was very risky. People thought it was risky. We knew it wasn't risky. We did it with schools that had not been doing a lot of sim. What we found was it made no difference. Everybody came out the same. And so invariably what happened then is that there were lots of deans saying, and this just happened to us, we're going to go to 50% sim. Hi, you are our new faculty member, and you're going to go to this, you're going to get this little sim certificate, and you're going to be running all the sims for 50% in every major clinical course, and you are our sim team of one. People do not know what they're talking about. This is still happening. It just happened. Somebody called and told me that they were smart enough to know that this was a really dumb idea. And so there's going to be a lot of crossover between different organizations and going to CE type things and for training, because there are nurses out there that are being tasked with doing things like this now, and they're going to be simulationists like you that are going to be asked to do these kinds of things. So I think attending each other's meetings is going to happen more and more and more. I see a lot of cross-pollination going on in the future. The next thing that happened is there are actual standards. There are standards for simulation. How many of you knew this? Okay, there are standards, and what's happened now is that the Society for Simulation and Healthcare is realizing, gosh, those standards are kind of really important too, and they are rewriting their accreditation standards for those of you that work in accredited simulation centers by SSH to include the ENACSL standards. And these are really important to you, perhaps more so than the SSH accreditation standards are, because they determine and give you best practices for running scenarios. These can be your best friends. So I'm going to talk about them within the context of they are currently being revised. So because they're being revised, and I'm the head of the committee, the head of the group that has the committee in it, I get to talk about them any way I want. So I'm going to give you inside dope on what is happening as they're revising those. They started out being numbered this way. They came out first in 2011. They were revised in 2013. For 2015, these standards were sent out to 20 different healthcare and simulation organizations around the world for input. So although they are the ENACSL standards of best practice simulation, they're really standards of practice for everybody because they're based on the evidence that's coming forward from research. So if you want to wonder what is the best way to run a scenario, it's included in these standards, which are free for download for you. So if you get that QR code that I set up a little while ago, you can do that, or you can just go to the website and download them. But I'm going to tell you and give you a preview of what is happening as we're revising those for the future. Your role is to know all of this stuff plus everything else. A new standard that was just published in 2015 is simulation design. It has a very long list, step by step by step, of how to design and run a scenario. The ENACSL standards are all really encompassed in these little boxes that you see flying around in the little wheel. And so if you want to read Standard 10, it is published in Clinical Simulation and Nursing. It is not in the one with the QR code right now because it's too new. The other two new one is Interprofessional Education. There are standards that go with that now. And again, it's not a super meaty standard at this point because we're still inventing stuff. We are not necessarily sure of best practices there, but I will throw in what I know and what was coming out as we're moving forward in time. Right now, there's a standard for facilitator and a standard for facilitation. When I read them together, remember I was not president or the vice president of research as this was happening and coming out. When you read these two as they are right now, I said these look like kind of the same thing to me. And you're trying to take, one is a noun, one's a verb, but it's basically the same thing. And so why would we not blend these two things together? So I think one of the things that's happening in the new standards as they come out is that they may unnumber them because it makes it look like there's a hierarchy there. So they said, well, there's really not. It's just the way that we got them written and they just happen to come out in these numbers. But when people read them, because of our U.S. paradigm, we tend to see number one, that must be the best, the most important. Number two, number three, number four, because we have these 10 best lists and things. That's really not what's going on. The most important part of simulation is the facilitator and the training of the facilitator and the debriefing. So they're going to combine, I think, facilitator and facilitation. The most important thing there is that these should be run by trained facilitators. This does not mean I read a book. It does not mean that. It means I've been to some kind of formal training. If I ask people, so what debriefing method are you using? And they kind of get the doe in the headlights look. For me, that tells me a lot. It means they haven't read enough in their discipline to know that there are names for different kinds of debriefing. If you can't tell me what kind of debriefing you're using at your school, I am concerned for you. You should be able to tell me. And if you can't, you need to be doing some reading and some learning so that you know what you're using. If that's where the learning occurs, and you are the wizards of the mannequins that help us learn how to do these things, you should be able to help us and tell us those kinds of things and be able to tell people about what kind of debriefing method are we using, why are we using this. And we know when we got this no difference between outcomes in the 50%, the 25%, the 10% group, we were using a high-level debriefing model called Debriefing for Meaningful Learning. It was developed by Dr. Chris Dryfirst. It's nice, it's good for novice learners, but there are many other kinds out there. Advocacy Inquiry, several others that exist. Please fill in those gaps in your own knowledge if you are not able to answer those questions. We know that the facilitator should be doing a pre-briefing orientation, and I see that you have a whole talk on this coming up. That is critical. It happens that I have a person 2 desks away from me in my very cramped group office at this point in time that just did her dissertation on pre-briefing and what does that mean, and she used Suzie certified people to answer and do a Delphi study on what should be done in pre-briefing and what does that mean. The word pre-briefing is really going to go away, I think, and it's going to be briefing is the what is happening before sim, and then debriefing is what happens after sim, if you're worried about that kind of thing. I don't think it makes that much difference, but as an academic, I like to have things neat and tidy, so that's happening. The objectives should be known. If you have rogue faculty who think, well, the students are doing really, really well in this scenario, I wasn't expecting them to do this well, so we're going to just take it up a notch or two, and this old mannequin's going to die, and then nobody knew that that was going to happen. That should not be happening now. That is not okay. And we've known that, I think, for a year or two now, and I think the word is getting out. We used to have wonderful debates and things at SSH about should the mannequin die, yes or no. And at a certain point in somebody's career, based on what they're going to do for a living, if you're going to work at ER or ICU, maybe that's probably a pretty good idea. If I'm working in OB, that's probably not a good idea, because I'm an OB nurse. So we did a lot of damage to people psychologically. We don't know who's coming into that sim. We don't know who just lost a baby or a mother or a dad. And what kind of thing are we doing to people when we do things like that? So the objectives of a scenario should be known before people walk in there. We should not have rogue faculty out there doing whatever they feel like when the time comes. And your job as that simulationist is to be able to look at them and say, actually the standards suggest that we should not be doing this, and if we're following standards, I would say that we really want to take another look at this and perhaps have a policy for ourselves here. I see people laughing. Does anybody have anything they want to say? I see lots of heads, kind of eyes, kind of like, whoa, I have to go home and tell people. What's happening? Does anybody want to share? Speak. Yes, you mean the standard about you should not be sharing information with others? I agree. There's a way to do that. You can still get to the objectives, but have 3 variations of a scenario. The other thing I love to do is change the name band and the names of people, and just change a couple things in the report, and it can throw them off very easily. And if they haven't checked the name band, that kind of puts the kibosh on everything, because you can come in as the facilitator and say, but I noticed you never checked the name band of your patient. This isn't who that is. So there's all kinds of things you can do to interrupt that sharing process, and have that talk with them, because that is one of our standards, is that when people do that, We always say there are consequences. I have never seen consequences happen to students, but you're taking learning away from someone else and that joy of discovery. So we don't want to do that. That the simulation progresses without interruption. There are many ways to go ahead and provide. I've heard about the box of opportunity, or we call it the cone of silence. If you have people who walk in and they kind of get the doe in the headlights look and they have no idea what to do, we have at times tape the box in the corner of the room, big enough for the whole group to get into, and say, if you go into the box, nobody can hear what you're saying, and you can come up with a plan, and when you get out of the box, you go back in to roll. So there are ways to do this. We call it the cone of silence. If any of you are Get Smart fans, you know what I'm talking about. Some of you are too young to know what Get Smart is, but some of us are old enough to remember that. And that the facilitator should have seen the scenario and be involved in the debriefing process. If it's an interprofessional simulation, interprofessional teams should have written the scenario, and they should debrief the scenario together. If you only have one kind of healthcare professional debriefing an interprofessional scenario, you're sending a message. The other people were too busy to be here, we don't really value this, and we're not modeling interprofessional behaviors in our debriefing processes. So those kinds of things are important to know. Reflective thinking and constructive feedback. We all go through a learning curve for how to give constructive feedback after we go over or the shock as a lecturer that what I said students cannot go in and enact immediately, because my lecturing is so wonderful that they should be able to do immediately what I have said. And we find out in simulation that's not true. And so some of us never get over the anger, and it's anger that this doesn't work the way I was told it worked all these years. And so those people probably don't need to be doing facilitation and debriefing. Do any of you have those people who probably should not be doing this? The standards can help you. So I'd be thinking about that. And the debriefing process. People say we don't have time for debriefing. I say if you don't have time for debriefing, you don't have time for simulation, because simulation is not where the learning occurs. It happens in the debriefing. So important to know. And we like to say things like, this simulation is going to help you practice at the edge of your expertise. It should not be so difficult that they have no idea what's going on. We should be able to cue them in some fashion, and I don't like voice of God cueing myself. I don't want people expecting voice of God to answer at every time that they don't know what's going on. That we should be competent in different methodologies of debriefing, that it is safe to make mistakes and admit errors. And once people get over that, then they can almost become too lackadaisical, because I don't necessarily need to come prepared, because it's okay to make mistakes, and if I really screw up, I'm going to hear about it in debriefing. So you can go to the other end of the spectrum. There has to be a happy medium here. And that we're trying to focus on the objectives. We're not trying to go rogue. And performance gaps are identified. I want to know what people know, and I want to help them identify what they need to know so that they're ready for the future. An important thing to do is always to ask if they did something right. I loved how you did this. I loved what you did here. Tell me what you were thinking when you did this. Because sometimes people do the right thing for the wrong reason. But if we don't ask them, we don't know that they did it for the wrong reason. So they almost look at a little matrix. Right thing, right reason, and you can say, absolutely, that was good thinking. They did the right thing, it's the wrong reason. You can now correct that fallacious thinking, because if you don't ever ask them, and they have now linked those two things irrevocably in their brains, when they do the right thing again for the wrong reason, it may not be the right thing. It may be the wrong thing for the wrong reason, and they don't know that. So asking why people did something right is every bit as important as asking why they did it and it was wrong, to help correct fallacious thinking. So be aware of that, and it's something that I only learned recently. I am still learning myself. Assessment and evaluation. I bet many of you know and have seen that when we say that this is summative evaluation, that people are still doing formative. They're talking away, they're interfering, they're passing people whether they really should be passed or not, because they're my student and I taught them, so they must actually be good. It's kind of like CPR. It's the same thing. I saw you do it right over here, but now when I'm testing you, you seem to have absolutely no idea what you're doing, but I saw you do it right over there, so we're going to kind of get you through this. I'm going to get you pencil whipped. Have you seen this? Okay. Many of you are going to have to be the person who says there's such a thing as formative evaluation and summative evaluation. Formative, you can talk and give them answers and help them out. Summative, we're through teaching now. This is what do you know. They don't know things. We have an article coming out about looking at Foley cath insertion. And when students have been checked off 4 different times by faculty over a bunch of semesters, when we finally put the student alone in a room with a mannequin and had him put in the Foley without somebody standing next to him and checking him off, 13 of 14 people failed miserably. This is typical. So when people check off their own students, they may or may not actually know what they're doing. What we know for summative evaluation is best practice is the person who's checking them off should not know this person from Adam, so that there is no bias whatsoever. I know this is hard to do, but when you're talking about summative evaluation, and a lot of nurses love summative evaluation, it's better to have people that you do not know, and research bears this out. There are lots of citations for this if you know where to look. Participant objectives, they should know what they are before they go in. If there is going to be a death involved, people should have an opportunity to opt out or to have an alternative assignment, or if you're going to have death and you don't want people to have those alternative assignments available, you should have a way for them to be able to see a counselor if they should need it afterwards. We haven't really thought about this before. I noticed that you have also here a talk on pediophobia. I think we have the first article ever about pediophobia, fear of dolls, in clinical simulation and nursing. It came from Boise State University many years ago. Did any of you know that pediophobia existed? How many of you knew that? How many of you had anybody who was in who experienced it? Look at that. Look around the room. This really does exist. Not common, but it's out there. So very, very interesting. So you have to get people over that these days, because I don't know if you're going to be able to work in healthcare without being able to work with a mannequin. So we have to know that that exists and come up with a strategy. If any of you come up with a strategy for dealing with that, that's a great little article. Absolutely. Yes, Ed. Absolutely. This happens. Many of us saw Talking Tina on Twilight Zone. I never got over it. So it's a little creepy to me too. If I say this, just ask somebody else who's laughing. You know what I'm talking about. It's very scary. Professional integrity of participants, and we've had this alluded to here. There's professional integrity of the learners. A lot of places have people sign something, says, I won't share what I learn in sim. This happens no matter what we do. So it's worthwhile if you've got something that is really important that you do not let them know, or you change it just enough that you throw off these people. What we find invariably over the course of a day, the beginning people are not that good. They get better and better and better. And by the end of the day, they come in and they're kind of just running everything all themselves, and they can debrief themselves. How is that happening? I used to think it was collective consciousness. Once knowledge gets out into the ether, it just kind of is there for everybody, and they kind of soak it up, and it gets better and better. But I don't believe that anymore. So it's important to know that, and that what are you going to do about it when that happens? And we can try to shame and blame people into not sharing the information, or make it a nice little thing. Don't share with others, because they're not going to get the same experience you do. I don't have an answer for this, but what I do have an answer for is a second group, the facilitators. Students do notice when we are talking about how some group did in the hallway, because it doesn't take them long to figure out who is in the group. And a lot of times we are amazed or we are dismayed by what people do. Or we say, man, and we say it, we do it all the time, and I know we do. We have to be very careful about our sharing of information with others. Having said that, there is a very professional thing that should be happening that means that we should be having the people in simulation, if they are not the same people in the clinical setting. If people in simulation are seeing somebody who is really dangerous, they have an obligation to share this information with the clinical people so that they know this. There should be communication about who's doing well and who is not. And if these people are not communicating, they need to be. We have identified, because we have a formal process now for sharing information in our own school, who's doing well, who's not, and we have confirmed that some people are very in need of help, and some people have been helped out of the program. Some people have been helped enough that they've actually been able to get better and get on with things. But there should be sharing of information. How many of you have sharing of information, a formal process? Another issue that we have not addressed well that needs to be addressed. Interprofessional education, all the rage. Everybody who gets to do this in real life? Not that many. It's really hard to schedule stuff. Curriculums are not built for this. It's very hard to get people together. A lot of places, the faculty just say, we're just going to do it anyway. We're going to do it out of hours. The first interprofessional simulation I was ever in was on a Saturday. Our school was out. It was in the summer. We didn't have any students there. We rounded up whoever we could find from nursing. We had a medical school that was in session. We had a PA school that was in session. We had some junior colleges of nursing that were in session. We all got together in a room. We ran scenarios that involved ACLS stuff. We had several ACLS qualified people in the room. And in debriefing, the students' voices of wisdom looked around and said, I don't know what a PA does. I don't know what your scope of practice is. And we all kind of have, because there was one of every profession faculty around at the outside watching. We were using fishbowl approach. And we looked at each other and said, when exactly do we teach that? When do we ever talk about what other disciplines do or what their scope of practice is? Huge missing area in any curriculum. What do other professions do, and how do we ever get together and learn about it until we graduate and we walk in and we're all supposed to know this stuff? So we had a big aha moment early on, which really spurred interprofessional education at our university. Perhaps you can have that same experience too. But it took us being willing to come in on days off in the middle of the summer to do it. And I think if you're devoted or committed or committable enough to do that, you can make things happen. Terminology. Terminology in actual standards is standard 1, terminology. I thought for years that it was supposed to be a dictionary or a glossary. And I would look up words because I write. I say, I want to use a standardized definition in my article here. I wonder if it's in this. And I would find words that I thought, these should be in here, not in this terminology. So when I finally found out how this was written and what it was really for, I said, it doesn't say this in it any place. And that the terminology standard 1 was supposed to be a glossary of the words that were used in the standards. It was never meant to be a dictionary. So when they started revising the standards, they started working on this dictionary instead of terminology. And of course, SSH has hired a for real lexicographer, one of 6 in the United States, to help them come up with a standardized dictionary for simulation. How many of you knew that? I see David, raise your hand. I know you know. You didn't know that. Okay. I was going to say he's holding out. He didn't want to be embarrassed because he'd be the only person who knew. No, they are. They're working on a dictionary. And so, of course, I got myself involved in that group. It was very, very interesting because guess where the first place you go to look up any word these days? Where on Google? No, that's so 20th century. Wikipedia. And of course, as a faculty member, it's like, oh, heresy would never look at. Everybody goes to Wikipedia today. And Wikipedia is more accurate than a lot of places for a lot of information these days. It's actually more, research shows it's more accurate than Encyclopedia Britannica because it's constantly updated by people in the professions that words are about. So when your academics got little noses in the air, just say, that's so 20th century. So I don't know if we're going to have terminology in the standards the next go around. If we can do it, but we're reinventing the wheel. Why would we not refer people to the dictionary? I'm just going to say that. And so there we were one day minding our own business when we were approached by SimGHOSTS to say, we think there should be a standard for technology. And for technologists, they said, hey, that's a great idea. And so this very active group of people, James Seipert among them, James, come on down, James. Tell us your story.
It was funny because Lori Leochi, who's on the board, we scheduled something to go into a heat conference because one of our visions is that we need to move outside of just healthcare. Sometimes we think the problem with healthcare simulation is the healthcare part, not the simulation part, because there's a lot of reinventing the wheel. So we happened to run into Lori Leochi out there, and just in I think it was a 10 to 15 minute conversation, she goes, "You need to write a standard for your role." And so we put together a team, Scott Crawford, Dr. Scott Crawford, myself, Rachel Bailey, Lance, that's the core group, right? So we got together and we just started having weekly meetings and started working on kind of what we thought a standard should look like. I'd already done some previous work. If you were in my research concepts class, we talked about the technology acceptance model, which kind of ties into what you were talking about. The fear of dolls. There's also a fear of technology. And I think as a group, we facilitate the easing of that process where you have someone that intends to use a particular product or a new technology. We can increase the perceived usefulness and ease of use of that product and increase the potential that it's going to be used. I noticed this early on when I saw the facility I went into and started visiting other facilities. There's units that were just sitting in closets all over the place, and subjectively I could tell you when I entered the room and I got into the picture and I stepped in, we went from zero use to almost 100% use in all of our courses, and within 6 months. Now that doesn't necessarily happen. How do you explain that? How do you put that on paper so academia goes, oh yeah, that's the process that happens, that's what's happened. So I tied it to the technology acceptance model. On the trip, we kind of are embarrassed that I did share this with Enaxel leadership. We finished the entire standard on the trip back from England. Lance and I, we had free time, 12 hours, and we knocked the rest of the standard out, got it submitted, and then it went through, started going, kicking back and forth, and we finally got it in. And this new standard now is being reviewed by SSH and others, and review board, and some other things that have come out of that is there's a call for us to have a peer review process, to have reviewers from our community of experts to review the submitted papers that go in. So when it does have to do with technology and has to do with simulation in that way, kicking it over to us to provide our expert views on that. So there's a lot of opportunity just beyond just writing articles, but also coming back and being part of that review process. You have expertise in a particular area, coming up and putting your insights on it. So the standard itself is based on those models, the underlying being the technology acceptance model, where behavioral intent is dictated by two factors of perceived usefulness and perceived ease of use. And it covers at least 6 domains. A few years ago, we talked about what your background has to be. I know the arguments were, well, I'm an EMT, or I'm a paramedic, and I make the best sim tech, and I have a business background, I'm an educator, or I'm IT. I was one of the only IT people at one of the first conferences. And we're seeing more. We're actually at half now that we have with technology backgrounds. But it wasn't so much about the background you had as much as it was, what did you bring to the table? What makes you good at what you do? And trying to capture that. So we tried to stop the argument, and we went into what the domains were. And we know that we touch in education, we touch in simulation, that's part of our role, but we also touch IT, AVS, we touch in a number of areas in professional development that we think that we need, and we in research and really looking at how we are participants in that, either conducting our own or looking at it, how do we move the arguments forward, and how our role is supposed to be actively involved in debriefing in the whole process. And then theater and stage was another domain that we think that we have to cover. And so in those domains, from that, we start developing curriculum. And you'll see that as we have some of my classes move forward here. We're going to be announcing our curriculum based off of this. But when we wrote this standard, without giving too much of the details, we'll see it through at the end. It really does cover what we have to do. And something we use a lot, the terminology that we tended to use a lot, is gain and maintain mastery of. So there's a lot of requirement that SimTech should gain and maintain mastery of information technology concepts and theory and that. Yeah, gain and maintain mastery of moulage, costuming, theater, stage. Gain and maintain mastery of healthcare concepts at a certain level. Now I know that's where we have some room for cutting down 20 pages of knowledge that we're supposed to have of concepts in healthcare and reducing it down to a top 20 to 30 that we should be maintaining mastery of. So when this standard comes out, we're most excited that it's been put out there. It's in the review process, and are very excited for it to complete that. It's going to be kicked back to us for review, I think a few more times. But it's very exciting, the work that everybody's done. And yes, and I'm going to bring Lance up because he has.
So thanks, James. I just want to point out how important I think this really is for us as a profession. Having brought James on board as a president and then the executive director now, his experience with his master's program and research and going through that process was not something I've ever had the opportunity to do. So he's been able to help us understand that we need to be able to speak to clinical educators and to academia in a language that they understand. And this was the very first thing that we've been able to accomplish in that kind of a dialogue. And so just like Suzie points out that we can use these standards to say, hey, look, here's what the baseline minimum is. Here's what the expectation is for us to be able to do excellent simulation. And so for us to be able to have this, this document that can now prove that, like, look, we are a valid part of the simulation experience, and we need to be trained in order to make a successful simulation program happen. So this to me is just phenomenal that we've been able to accomplish this, and I'm really excited about more of this kind of work.
Yeah. So it wouldn't have happened without the support of our vendors, the manufacturers. It wouldn't have been able to be happening without Anaxle and some forward-thinking individuals. In fact, I've met with some people from Anaxle, and it was just amazing some of the comments that were being made that I had not heard in my little bubble where I was. There was a lot of resistance. There was a lot of things that would come against me, and it forced me to move to research so I could then say, hey, listen, this is what the research says. This is what you guys don't know technology. So why? And putting that forward and challenging them in that way, without getting into subjective arguments over different things. It was refreshing to have forward-thinking individuals that really do see the value in us as a profession. And I think that's ultimately where we need to move. A lot of us kind of are wild, wild west. We're out there. We just get things done. We work around it. It's the same spirit that most nurses have. The IT guys and technology guys all have that mentality. We move forward. We just kind of handle whatever comes our way. And we need to bring our professionalism up a little bit in the way that we elevate the way we talk about things and sharing how we do what we do. And they're already breaking down some of the kind of institutional structure that kind of makes it unattractive for us to be there. And I think somewhere in the middle, us meeting, we're going to be able to make ourselves a profession. So, and that's really, the whole idea behind the standard. And this really does, like Lance says, I think it's a watershed moment. It's just really going to change the way that simulation is done overall, and helping save lives. I think is that's the end goal. So, thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm going to hand it back to.
I've got a little more. Okay. But we have not reached the end of my talk yet, and I have the best for actually, I thought this was pretty good. But maybe this is the best for last. Hot off the press. How many of you work in nursing? Okay. So get ready, because your earthquake is about to hit. Shouldn't have said that in LA. The National Council of State Boards of Nursing, really the ultimate goal of any research is that it changes policy. And the National Council of State Boards of Nursing research study, after it came out and showed that there was no harm done with 50% simulation if it's done well, they had a meeting get together in Chicago and write guidelines for the use of simulation from the National Council. And that's like going to Mount Olympus. Those standards or guidelines for the use of simulation for the boards of nursing will be published in October in the Journal of Nursing Regulation. If I was thinking about what documents would I use to help write guidelines for the use of simulation, I would read the National Council study, first of all, because you will be able to pick up in the end what did they do, because that's probably what they're going to tell us we need to do. You're right. But that group also used the standards for accreditation for SSH. And anybody should be using the standards of accreditation from SSH to build a good simulation program, whether you go for accreditation or not. It helps give you legs to stand on. So I would say that if you want to know what's going to be in those guidelines before you get your hands on that article with the nice, amazing list and then the checklist at the end, just look at those two documents, the actual standards, the SSH guidelines for accreditation, and then just start pulling those and then just wait for the article to come out, because it's all going to be there. And what does that mean? What am I telling you? What that means is that boards are going to when they're each of their 50 states and territories and every place else, I see people clapping hands, yay! Oh baby, this is the best! The boards are going to say this is what you have to do and what you have to be able to report. And usually I said, so how does this really work? Do boards kind of do poo-poo platter and they say, well, we want to do this, but we don't want to do this? And I was told, and again, I can say this in this room, they said, well, no, actually most boards don't ever want to kind of step out ahead of anybody else or say we're smarter than the National Council. We only want to do these things. We don't want to do those things. So usually what happens is when we speak, which is we have to be very careful about how we speak, is that they're adopted en toto. They're just going to take it and say, here, these are the rules. So be thinking about that. Look at those two documents and then wait for that article to come out in October, because those are going to be the rules. And what I'm telling you is you have a full lifetime career in simulation and simulationists. So this is job security for all of us as long as we want to work. It's a wonderful time to be in simulation, is all I've got to say. And that is how I'm going to close. Do you have questions for me? Questions, comments? Yes. I don't know, and I don't know. Yes. Next. No, I don't, in all honesty, I don't have a good feel for that. There were two state boards that were there with us as we wrote these guidelines. I won't tell you who they are, because that way you can all believe that your board was considered forward thinking, because most of them aren't. So it was wonderful to be there with them, because they're looking for guidance too. And what was very interesting was there was somebody from NLN, which is one of the big accrediting bodies for nursing schools, and from CCNE or AACN, the other accrediting body that does BSN type programs and higher. And they said, we've had the thought too. When we go and we visit schools, and everybody wants to show us their simulation center, whether the mannequin's got dust in his eyes or not, they want to show us the simulation center. Whether it's being used or not, they want to show us. But we don't know what we're looking at. We don't know how to use this. We know nothing about sim, but everybody's really proud of it. So we don't know if people are pulling wool over our eyes or not. Now everybody's going to know. So what I suspect will happen is that AACN and NLN will also adopt accrediting rules for the use of sim and training of faculty. And the way you guys have job security, if you're a nurse, okay, you got it made, except there's not enough of you. The other way is that you can't do everything, so you're going to need another body, which means you're going to need a for real simulation program and center, which means that simulationists, for real specialists in tech, are going to have to be there to help run a successful simulation center, especially if you want to do a lot of sim. So it's a great time. Great time. Other questions or comments? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. Suzie. I always forget to say Suzie. Right now, we're going to finish up real quick, and we have it's just so exciting what's been happening over the last year. I always joke around with Lance because I think sometimes we don't even know that we're not supposed to be in certain conversations, and we end up in these conversations with global leaders and whatnot. And I guess what we have to say has been taken and been important. So I just want to thank everybody's effort. I really want to encourage you to heed the call for that. It's our voice. We need to be writing papers. We need to be looking out and being involved and giving ideas about the type of research that needs to be conducted, and get your head in it and start getting our voice out there on what it is, because we really do have something important to say, and across the board. And I really want to encourage everybody to do that and learn whatever you can. Even if you come from a technical background, you're not in academia, you've just been doing what you do and you're good at it and that's it. We have to put that on paper. We have to be able to explain it. We have to be able to give it out because we come from a different perspective. As an IT guy, the first thing I looked at when I saw a SimMan 3G is a computer. And that has a whole bunch of other ramifications that go in with it, and I didn't see it any differently. I then started using resources that we've been using in IT for years. And it helped me organize things, keep things more smoothly. I started using other tools to organize it. And those things, once you start sharing it, people latch onto it, and you start realizing, okay, there's a lot more to this and a lot easier ways of getting things done than trying to reinvent the wheel internally, kind of like a circular firing squad, and kind of jump out beyond the boundaries of just healthcare and realize that this is something bigger, and simulation is its kind of own thing that kind of healthcare is doing, aviation, and it's just a neat experience. So along with this, we've developed, we started early last year, we got our affiliation, if you've been paying attention, with ASPE in England. From there, some conversations began with Sim Australia or Sim Australasia, and a number of other affiliations that we've had, and I'll have Lance come up and highlight some of those here shortly. But another one, the big one that we've been working on for quite a while, and it's been a long process, and I think as we've moved forward, is with SSH. And today I have Kevin Helm that I want to have come up and say a few words about our newest affiliation and strategic partnership. So everybody give a big round of applause for Kevin.
Good morning. Thanks for letting me take a quick moment. My name is Kevin Helm. I'm the Associate Executive Director for SSH. And real quickly, what we have to announce today and make public is a strategic partnership between SSH and SimGHOSTS. More details to come, but overarching goal is to leverage the expertise and training that SimGHOSTS brings to the table and still offer the certification, the CHSOS, from SSH, and then bring to you more educational offerings through the SSH programs and so forth. So I think that's pretty exciting. We will have more details to come in the next few months as we get through some of this, and look for a press release. Thanks a lot for your time.
Okay, so with that, that's very exciting for us. We're continuing to partner with globally with organizations, and the core thing being that we're providing that training. And just to highlight what we intend on doing, because there's another announcement that I'd like to make, is along those, taking the CHSOS standard and working on that and getting the objectives that are there. We're developing and have already been in the process of developing a comprehensive curriculum that we're going to deliver online for everybody, tied to our events here, and developing partnerships with local hospitals and universities so that we can have a practicum portion of that we can send people to do, to have checkoffs with what they're doing. So we're in the works on that. We've developed a research team, that kind of a committee that if you're interested in being a part of that, that's where the donations for the t-shirts are going, to build up that part of what we do, to kind of elevate the dialogue that we're having in this organization, and to provide the kind of research ideas that we can partner with other organizations to start conducting. And with the curriculum itself, if you're interested in developing that, we're looking for content experts in healthcare and simulation in general. We're trying to create some things from scratch. And a little bit of, since I have all the vendors' attention in this room, I know certification, professional development, and that kind of stuff requires, and usually is driven by manufacturers. And from the from my IT background, I realized that Microsoft, Cisco, and everybody else you can think of in the technology industry at one point about 20 years ago got together, put down their differences in competition, and started really working out something of a plan to standardize some of the practice. On our side, on the academic side and the universities and healthcare, they can only do so much as far as standard of practice, how they're going to operate these things. As far as maintaining them, technology, how they work and operate, we do have to move to a vendor-neutral type training programs so that we can provide mobility for you guys, so that just because you're in a Gamard shop, you have the expertise to then move to another organization and have that mobility and freedom to be a professional no matter where you go, having experienced all the mannequins that are possibly out there, being knowledgeable in all of them. And that's going to require some significant help from vendors. So I kind of want to put that out there across the board. Vendor neutral does not mean not vendor specific. Doesn't mean that we won't be highlighting specific things about it, but it does mean that we don't highlight one over the other as far as that goes. But provide a consistent training. What that looks like in the future, we don't know, but I would appreciate the dialogue to continue. So from there, I'd like to bring Ryan up and move us on to wherever we're going to go. Or